Welcome to another of our series in Judgment Date, a series of programs that we've been doing, trying to make sense of the consequences of COVID-19 and help people through what's clearly a very difficult, indeed traumatic time. And today, it's a great privilege to welcome the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand, and I might add, apart from that, being a very, very significant political commentator, Professor Adam Habib. Adam, you write so much, it's difficult to kind of sort of track everything down, but I wanted to talk to you a bit about the recent article that you wrote about political parties, because it seemed to me that that touched on so much of our present condition. So is the idea that, is your idea that actually what's been happening on the campuses to a large degree is a complete disconnect between, if you wish, politicians on the campus and the students you have who have an entirely different set of objectives?
Absolutely. I think that that's the real problem. I think that political parties have become really, really toxic in the universities. They tend to destabilize the universities, and they don't represent the interests of the students they claim to represent. So if you look at almost all of the campuses, the SRC elections are dominated by political parties. It might be the ANC ones, which are SASCO and the ANC Youth League. It might be the EFF Student Command. But independents are effectively pushed out of the student governance processes. And party apparatchiks, if you like, have begun to dominate the governance structures and very rarely represent the interests of students. The most dramatic example of this was on online education. And so in a sense, we decide that we can't afford to let the students lose the next 3 or 4 months. We effectively decide to go online. The SRC correctly says, but what about the students who don't have access to devices? So we say, fair enough. We go out, we purchase 5,000 laptops because we assume that our demand is between 3,500 or 5,000. And we convince the post office in the middle of a lockdown to deliver those devices. We then negotiate with every one of the telcos to provide 30 gigabytes of data so students can connect in. And 2 things happen. The student leadership still opposed online education. And I then said to them, but how do you explain the fact that 85 or 89% of the people are actually logging online? And they said, well, those people are not conscious enough. They're all petty bourgeois individuals. So I said, but you are meant to represent them, and you have this entirely patronizing attitude towards them. You think they're all conservative, and the group of you are the wisdom of all that is politically correct. And that kind of vanguardism is what frightens me. And it seems to me that that is truly typical of student activists and how they engage with the broader university community, which is why you have such low elections, turnouts in SRC elections. WIT's at 18%. And this is a common pattern. This is not unique to WIT. It's common to all institutions. I reflected on an engagement on my Twitter account between a student who was challenging the leadership, saying, actually, I like online, and the way they responded to him. And I'm saying that we've got a problem. And unless we as a country confront this, we're going to destroy our institutions, but we're also going to alienate the vast majority of students who I think are delightful young men and women who are conscious, socially just, but pragmatic in the way they need to operate in this world.
But can I just ask you, that I noticed that Twitter exchange, and one of the things you said there, which interested me, was that the student who had sort of, or it might have been the engagement, one of the students who came from a rural community was embracing the initiative. And then the student who, in a sense, said, if you wish to use your term, the vanguard of students, saying, this is some sort of bourgeois kid who doesn't know what the hell politics are, you presumed was much more an urban student. And I wondered, and more affluent, is there something here where And what is it that's causing, let's say, more affluent students to take that vanguardist position at the expense, as it were, of the vast majority of the students, many of whom come from far more impoverished communities?
So I don't think this is uncommon. We all know that Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels came from more privileged circumstances. I was an activist.
Yes, absolutely, yeah.
In an early year, and actually came from a more privileged circumstance and was able to do it. So I think part of this has to do with the fact that you don't have to bear the consequences. If you're a rural student from the middle of the Transkei, you need to pass your degree. You can't afford to lose a year because there's an entire extended family waiting for you to start earning an income in which you can support them. If you're a middle-class kid, you don't have those kind of enormous pressures. And often that's the first issue that needs to be considered. It seems to be the second. The people who do come to dominate in the leadership structures come there through connections. They come there through contacts. They come there through linkages. So often they are the children of civil servants or the children of politicians. And so, in a sense, because they come from more privileged circumstances, they can navigate the politics and the networks that allow you to come into leadership. And I think both those issues are effectively what allows these students to dominate in the way they do. But I think there's a third as well, that in a sense, I think that middle-class Black students are alienated. They're alienated because, in a sense, they feel that the vision that they were sold by the political party, sometimes by the daddies and mummies, sometimes by the leadership, is actually not what they see. And so they're
right about that, surely.
They're right about that. And so they're very, very alienated. And so they go to what I call as an extreme politics. And an extreme politics is to reject everything. But the dangers in rejecting this kind of stuff is that you can land up without thinking pragmatically about how to transform. I often make the argument, transforming society takes thought. It takes strategy. It requires work. It requires reading and trying to understand other points of view and how you navigate it. It can't rely simply on rhetorical spectacle. And too much of that exists there. And then I must say, finally, I think that there's a politics that, particularly since 2015 and 16, that has emerged by the parties where they've created an incentive structure. That if you create mayhem, if you create a little bit of a base, we will give you a place in national parliament and you'll earn 1.2 or 1.3 million. And so there's an interesting challenge. You want to belong to the party because you know your future position is dependent on it. But you need to create enough mayhem to create a base for yourself. But you don't want to alienate the party too much. So what do? Is you hone in on the university, criticize the university, create mayhem there, even though the very party you belong to creates the policy infrastructure that limits what the university can and cannot do.
Now, you haven't made yourself very popular with certain of your own staff who support their line. Why do you think they support their line and they're so critical of you?
Because I do think that the progressive movement has always been divided into two or three elements. We know that there's been a significant debate in the progressive intelligentsia for the last century on more zero-sum outcomes, a revolution, overthrow the state, and effectively a second vision, which is more Gramscian in a sense, that sees society being transformed through a series of structural reforms. In a lot of ways, I think I see myself as part of a Gramscian logic, that I wish the world was a much better place, but it is not. And that you've got to operate in the real world. And what that means is navigate that will try to understand the kinds of strategic interventions you need to make and to allow those reforms to play out so that it has, if you like, a cumulative effect of transforming society. There's the second view, which is anti to that, which is really doesn't believe in leadership, doesn't believe in compromise, it doesn't believe in measured outcomes, that actually sees, they don't put it, but their view is what you do is implode society and hope for the best. And I think that the current manifestation of this has gravitated towards a notion of social justice that is zero-sum. So it says, let's go to the lowest common denominator. And the lowest common denominator is, if everybody cannot be online, nobody should. It's a kind of Cambodian or Chinese cultural revolution agenda. You know, what people did is send the academics to the fields and become peasants. So what Stalin did is kill the bloody peasants and destroy agriculture so that everybody is then equal. And that kind of, what I imagine a Stalinist interpretation or a kind of Pol Pot interpretation of social justice has infected the progressive movement and has infected in particular the student leadership. And I worry about that.
Well, I do too. And the consequence I wanted to ask you about was that when I read your column, it struck me that you were talking way beyond the student community, that the implications of your piece were talking to the society at large. And I'm struck by the fact, where is the vision, the progressive vision for getting this society out of the mess that it's in at present? And I suppose if one was listening to this discussion between you and I, and you went to the university community, the two of us are, you'd kind of think, well, if the universities aren't thinking these thoughts, who is? So where's this? I mean, do you think that this crisis is going to precipitate, at least in some sense of reflection, of a narrative or a framework which gets us into a much more progressive frame of thinking than we've been up till now?
So I think that that this is happening. So I think that it's happening at two levels. I think it's happening at the political level with some trepidation, but I'll speak to that, and I think it's happening in the academic level. Right. So within the universities, I think there is a progressive intelligentsia grappling with these issues. There are those who have a zero-sum interpretation of this, but effectively there is a broader layer that I think are socially conscious. They're conscious of inequality, and they are looking at addressing structural reforms of some kind or the other in addressing it. So you've seen Achille Mbembe write about these kinds of questions and how we reimagine society. You've seen economists like Imran Balodia and the Southern Center for Inequality beginning to look at new forms of economic policy. You're seeing people like Harun Borat and others write about how you address inequality, but in much more pragmatic ways. So there is a discourse. I've, for instance, in the book, Rebels in Rage, went through an entire chapter saying, here's how I think you can do free education, but in a way that is over 10 or 15 years, and here's the mechanisms. I think that there is a discourse that is playing out. And I actually think that the vast majority of people at a place like Wits are reflective of that tradition that I speak about. And, you know, I've probably been the Vice-Chancellor with most knives at my back. And every single time I've appealed to the Senate, or even in 2016 to the students and the Senate came out in a more pragmatic and progressive direction. So when the students said, implode the campus, and I went and said, should we keep the campuses open, even if I have to bring in police? 80% of them voted. When when I came up for a renewal 2 years ago, and the Senate was good, these people objected. But I won the overwhelming support of Senate. And because I think that the vast majority of students, staff, I think they have their heart in the right place. I think that they instinctively where I am, and I think where you are. So that's the, I think the problem is they are silenced. So they see the spectacle. They see the really onerous discourse in the public engagement. And they silenced by the political apparatchiks of one kind or the other. And that's why you will see over the last year and a half, 2 years, I've deliberately started taking on this publicly, saying I'm going to confront you because appeasing you emboldens you. And that's not acceptable. So that's the one part. The second part is within the political system. And I think instinctively somebody like Cyril knows that inequality is not sustainable. And I think he instinctively is moving towards a notion of social democracy. And that notion of social democracy is to create a pact, is to be more pragmatic, is to regulate capital rather than completely demolishing it. And I think that can sell it to a broader public in a way. He needs to be people into advancing this agenda. In a sense, you have to lead it. And I'll give you one example where I thought he missed the opportunity. On land, when the debate emerged 18 months ago, instead of simply tackling the EFF response to land, which has changed the constitution, and this, what he could have said is actually, there is a more productive way to address land. That I'm going to deploy state land for this use. I'm then going to demand big capital, mining capital, to give up land that I will redistribute to communities around. And in a sense, Anglo-Platte last year gave up 350 hectares of land, which they distributed to the community. It seemed to me that if Cyril had taken examples of that, honed it on and packaged it as a means to address the land question, then that would be leading from the front. Instead, what we did is we took the EFF narrative and added to it a notion that said, we'll do this, but provided food security is not threatened. And in a sense, we're not winning the political discourse. You know, whatever you might say about Mbeki, and there's much that you can criticize him, Mbeki led. He had an agenda, and he led on that agenda.
Is the product, then, can I ask you on that, just to probe you on that, is that a function of Ramaphosa having a different style of leadership, which is much more consensual, which gets you into the difficulties? Or is that a product of a balance of political forces within his own party, which is making it a lot more difficult for him than perhaps it was for Mbeki to do what he did at the time?
I think it's both. I think it's both. I think in part it's a style of leadership of Cyril that effectively does like building a consensual agenda. But I also think that you're not going to defeat the state capture faction by appeasing them and charming them. And you're going to have to at some point confront them and say, if you play this agenda, there shall be consequences. You see, in the article I speak about student leadership, and one of the things I say is there's a debate at places like Wits, etc. How do we cultivate a leadership that is more inclusive, that is more reflective of the student community, that is not as patronizing and vanguardist as this leadership is? And we have all of these educative and acculturation processes. And I'm debating with my dean of students, and I say, I think that that's important. Don't mistake me. But I think that that alone doesn't do it, because consequences is as much an educative process as acculturation and education itself. And I think the same applies to Cyril, that in a sense, if you in the state capture crowd and you believe that there are no consequences to stealing, you'll continue to steal. However much you speak about radical economic transformation, it is only when there's a serious consequence for stealing, then you will shift. And it seems to me the state applies to students. We can beg students not to disrupt classes the more firmer component of this, the more consequential, the more part has not been prepared to do. And until he does, he's going to struggle to lead in the way that he needs to lead.
Well, there's a lot there. I mean, I see that the students would not like to be compared to the stealers of state resources, but let's leave that for the moment. And ask, I appreciate, on the other hand, of course, if you're burning down buildings, I'm not quite sure what the difference is. Okay, fair enough. But let me ask you this. As you look at the way in which the government is dealing with COVID-19, I mean, there are many commentators who are suggesting that the securocrats, if not in control, certainly are playing an excessively important role in the trajectory that we're going. Do you agree with that?
So I think that they are at one level, and I think that the dilemmas of Cyril are more complex than we imagine. So let me ask you, I'm trying to understand, why is it that somebody like Cyril, who really has been oriented towards looking at the evidence, and to be honest, William Keyes, and bringing in scientists in conversations to advise them on how to deal with the pandemic, why do they do that on the one hand, and then outlaw, pass regulations that don't allow you to buy undergarments or open shoes or the kinds of things that they're doing? And I think that it's got to do with something more than we imagine. You see, I think that they correctly recognize that if you're going to deal with COVID-19, you have to deal with alcohol, particularly alcohol in beer halls, alcohol in shebeens, because people collate in shebeens, there's no social distancing that happens, and there's consequences for that. But if you're going to deal with shebeens, you can't seem to be seen to be acting only against the poor. The penalties of this pandemic must be seen to be borne by everybody, because if it's only borne by the poor, then the state capture crowd and the EFF will say, you see, you're the running dogs of white monopoly capital. So as much as you hit the guy in the shebeen, you've got to hit Dennis Davis who wants his red wine, because it looks bad if Dennis Davis is sipping his red wine while the guys are prevented to go for the shebeens. And that's why you have this kind of completely irrational actions about why would you stop people from jogging? Because that's what you see middle class people doing. And you want to show that we're not only penalizing the poor, that we're asking them to take some pain as well. And at the heart of this is the dilemma that the political leadership is confronting. And it seems to me when Glenda Gray is critiquing it, or when Imran Valodia is critiquing it, they forget that this is the political management that is happening, and they don't realize this. They see the irrationality of the act. What they don't look at is, why are you doing it? And I think that that's the thing. So I'm not so sure, coming back to your question, that the securocrats are controlling this. I think that there is no doubt Becky Kele and others are of the view that stopping alcohol actually reduces violence. And I think that there's evidence of that. And it reduces the burden on hospital beds. And so we got to do that. But to sell that becomes difficult unless they make life slightly uncomfortable for the middle classes. And these other regulations is meant to enable that.
Well, let me ask a second question then. When people see a very eminent scientist being publicly rebuked by the acting Director General of Health in the way that Glenda Gray was, there's a serious kind of concern of, hang on a minute, what's going on here? I mean, do we have to be so heavy-handed? Do we not, a quiet word to her to say, well, maybe you should have said this privately before you said this publicly. I can understand that. I really can get my head around that. Or this is inaccurate, or maybe we've got to deal with this. But the way it was done seemed to be a default position of repression rather than deliberation.
So I think that that's a real issue. I was quite involved in the public discourse around the Glenda Gray issue. So here's where I think one could argue, and I've said this to Glenda, that she should have sent the advisory to the minister before actually engaging in the public domain. Just protocol. I
agree with that. Yeah.
And I think, given that she didn't, there was a legitimacy to Zweli Mkhize publicly holding her accountable, because he then said he was sharp, but he was fair. What he said is, here are what you said, here is the response, this is why it's unacceptable. And I think, even though he was sharp, I think that that was fair. I think what happened after was unacceptable. And that is where the acting DG decides, I am going to go after Glenda Gray, write to the board and ask them to investigate and fire her. And that's why I think so many of us stood up and said, this is unacceptable. This is not acceptable. And I think the big question you've got to pose, and I really don't have the answer to this, was this Anban, the acting DG, acting as part of bureaucratic overreach to please his masters? Or was really saying, go after and teach her a lesson? I would hate to think that it was the latter. I would hope to think that it was the former, and that effectively Anban learned his lesson and this will not happen. But I do worry that the latter may very well be, at least in some political circles, and this is why it was important that so many people stood up and said this is unacceptable.
I think the whole country would say amen to that. Can I, because I'm running out of time, so I want to ask you one final question. As you look at this, what do you think the prospect, I mean, because your analysis again, which I said extended beyond the students to a kind of intolerance and a populism and a vanguardism which goes beyond student politics. Do you think that we're going to emerge out of COVID-19 with our constitutional democracy being able to be strengthened, or are we going to be weakened?
I think that there's some huge threats to it. And I think it really does depend on the art of political leadership, particularly by people like Cyril Ramaphosa, but also by intellectuals. I think that the economy is going to be seriously battered. And I think that the inequalities are going to be seriously growing. And in that context, there's going to be groups of proto-fascist groups and entrepreneurs, ethnic entrepreneurs that are going to try and mobilize on the extreme discontent that's going to exist in society. And I think that the vast majority of society, and frankly, I think even the president himself, have an alternative politics that says we need to heal the inequality, we need to learn to share, we need to set up a social justice mandate, we need a partnership between the private sector and the state that impacts beyond the middle classes on the poor itself. And I think that that's a politics that is winnable. And I think the vast majority of South Africans will gravitate towards it. But we need to package it in a way that can sell it. We mustn't be ashamed of that politics. The problem I get is too many ANC politicians who are thoughtful tend to say to you one thing in quiet, and then they play the radical economic transformation game in public. What you've got to do is package your politics and not be ashamed of it, and package it in a way that speaks to the vast majority of our people. So the question you're asking is, will we come out intact? The answer is, are we prepared to lead? And are we prepared to package the politics in a manner that we need to? And I'm not seeing enough of that from the political leadership.
So if you were a betting man, what would you say?
If I was a betting man, I would say we'd lumber on like we have in the last 2 years. And that's just not enough. Yeah. It's not good enough. That's the problem. If I was betting, however, the mercy we have, the mercifulness of where we are, is that the proto-fascists and the state capture ground, however much they virulent, they're just so incompetent. that they're not very good at effecting their agenda as well. And my fear is we'll lumber on like we've done in the last 2 years, rather than decisively lead to an inclusive agenda.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we've run out of time. I also know that you're not that long to go before you go to what I suppose we call Borryville these days.
That's true.
Yeah,
6 months time.
Which is a much worse politics, I should tell you, but that's up to you.
That is true.
But I hope you come back because, frankly, you know, whether you agree with you or disagree with you, public intellectuals like you are utterly crucial to have these kinds of engagements, and these kinds of engagements are vital if we're going to not lumber on but move forward. So, firstly, good luck for that. I hope to see you soon. But thank you very much for this afternoon. Thank you a lot.
Thank you, Dennis.